Welcome to At the Farm Gate. I'm Jack Hughes, and today we're joined by Dorothy McKeegan, an expert in animal welfare and humane management in poultry. We'll be exploring how science and ethics guide practices to ensure the well-being of birds, even in challenging situations. With ongoing pressures on poultry health and biosecurity, understanding welfare science is more important than ever. Whether you're a farmer, a vet, or simply interested in how research supports compassionate care, the discussion has insights for everyone. So welcome, Dorothy.
Thank you.
So could we start today by telling us a little bit about yourself and what inspired you to work in animal welfare and research?
Yeah, thanks. So I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Glasgow and I teach animal welfare and ethics at the vet school here. I was always interested in animal biology, so I did a degree in zoology, and through that I became fascinated by animal behaviour. There wasn't really any welfare content in that first degree, but then I saw that there was a master's available in Edinburgh in animal behaviour and welfare. And that's when I was first exposed to welfare science, and I became really intrigued by the potential of behaviour to help us understand animal welfare and improve the lives of animals. So after my master's, I did a PhD in poultry, and I've become a welfare researcher since then, and I've worked on poultry ever since. I became, I love poultry.
Yeah, I found once you get into the poultry field, it's very hard to leave.
Absolutely, yeah.
So you touched on it a little bit there. Your research is focused on, assessing welfare by examining animal experience. How does this understanding help improve welfare standards within the poultry industry?
Well, there are actually multiple definitions of animal welfare, but increasingly welfare scientists agree that welfare is what animals feel. It's their experiences. But of course, these mental states of animals are very hard to observe directly, or they're impossible to observe directly. So it's a really big scientific challenge to try and assess these states and determine how animals are feeling. What we can do is we can assume the animal is sentient, so it's capable of these kind of positive and negative states. And then from inputs, things we do to the animals, things that happen to them, and outputs, things they do in their behaviour and their physiology, all we can do is infer those mental states, and that's what we tend to do. But by characterising welfare as mental states, I think it's quite a helpful way to focus on the animal and help determine the harms that we might be doing and their causes, and try and take steps to improve welfare based on that. So that's been my approach to trying to improve welfare.
Very interesting. So in the work that you've been doing in your study methods used to manage birds during potential disease outbreaks, including when it's necessary to cull affected flocks, could you give a little bit of information or explain in broad terms what considerations guide these decisions to balance the welfare, the biosecurity, and the ethical responsibility of us within the industry?
Yeah, it's a complex situation, isn't
Mhm.
it? So, of course, the decision to cull an affected flock is usually primarily supported by the need to minimise the risk of disease transmission to other poultry. That's usually the primary goal. And of course, if it's a potentially zoonotic disease, to protect public health. Um, and of course, it could be argued that this culling step, although regrettable, also ends the suffering of any birds that are currently affected by the disease, which of course we want to do quickly. But the actual decision to cull and the method we use actually depends on a wide range of considerations other than welfare. Practicality, what can actually be achieved at the site, throughput, which can relate to the flock size, the type of housing they're in. Is it available for rapid deployment if it's an urgent situation? Even things like cost and environmental contamination can be part of the decision. So these are all in the mix, as well, of course, as trying to use a method that minimises the risk of disease transmission itself. So it's a really complex situation. And for all these reasons, animal welfare is understood and I think accepted to not be the only priority in these control situations. And that, of course, can be ethically challenging because we always want to do our best for the animals. I think what's good about this is we do have methods that do manage to balance all these factors quite well, I think. But I think, we have to acknowledge the complexity of the situation and the multiple goals we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, of course, and obviously, when we're talking about mass depopulation, particularly in poultry, carbon dioxide is the main method or the method to be used but from a welfare perspective, what are the main concerns with this approach from your side?
Well, there are two main concerns with using carbon dioxide. The first is that it can be painful. So at high concentrations, carbon dioxide will activate specialized receptors in the nose and mouth of the bird, and that can lead to a pain sensation. So at high concentrations, there's a reaction that we know can be painful. However, if we apply CO2 gradually, we can avoid this because the birds become gradually unconscious because CO2 is an anesthetic. So the birds gradually lose consciousness and sort of go into a sleep-like state. And that can happen before we reach the painful threshold. So the anesthetic effects can happen at lower levels. So that's a good approach. However, even with this approach, another concern is that CO2, breathing in CO2 has effects on the respiratory system, and that can cause the birds to breathe, take bigger and longer breaths, just to kind of hyperventilate. Um, and actually, when we can see birds doing this, if you watch birds breathing CO2, you can see them doing these big breaths. Now, the welfare implications of this are actually not very clear. It may be uncomfortable for the birds to breathe this way, or it may not, and we honestly don't know. And we're actually currently studying this in a research project in collaboration with the University of Newcastle. It may be that the birds experience a sort of air hunger, a sort of difficulty breathing, because that's what humans report when they breathe CO2,
Mm.
even at quite low levels. However, it's important to say that the respiratory system of birds is very different to humans and any mammal. So we really don't know genuinely whether this is a problem. So that's what we're examining at the moment. But it's certainly a risk. So it's important that we can minimise that duration as far as possible, the duration that they're awake and aware and breathing like that if we can. But of course, we don't want to go too fast and then we might cause pain. So
Yeah.
it's a bit of a balance between the duration of exposure and the concentration of CO2 that we apply.
So just looking at that now, we know CO2 is the main factor. I mean, what work is there involved with the likes of using nitrogen and the work that you're doing in controlled atmospheric stunning?
Yeah.
Is there anything you could elaborate on that?
Yeah, of course. So it's usually better to use these inert gases to cause unconsciousness and then the death of the birds because we don't have the activation in the same way of that respiratory effect. Bearing in mind, we still don't completely know its welfare implications. The problem with using the inert gases, especially nitrogen, is that it's got a very similar density to air. So if you're trying to apply that in poultry housing, then of course it becomes very difficult to eliminate enough oxygen
Yeah.
to get the birds to actually succumb to that because birds have got a super efficient respiratory system. They can get oxygen that's very low level and still keep going, much more efficient than mammals. So that means we need to get the oxygen very, very low before we can actually have an effective system. If we put the birds into a container, like a containerized gassing unit, then we can potentially use these inert gases or certainly much lower levels of CO2. And I know that is an approach that is used by LiveTech and others in some cases. So we would prefer the inert gases, but they're just not possible to apply in poultry housing. We need the density of CO2 to build and to eliminate the oxygen and to have that anaesthetic effect.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's really interesting, and as you say there about uh, particularly chickens and laying broilers and laying hens being able to gather on the small amounts of oxygen. I mean,
Absolutely, yeah.
from my perspective, and obviously we know ducks, for instance, have a bit of a longer threshold. I mean, is this from your can they hold the breath longer, or is it
Well,
because they
yeah,
can?
so ducks are even better. Ducks have got adaptations for diving. They've got a diving reflex. So as soon as there's a limitation in oxygen, they have a big reduction in heart rate, a lowering of the metabolic demands for oxygen. So they can go even longer. It'll take them even longer to succumb. But they will succumb, obviously, if oxygen is low enough for long
Yeah.
enough. And also they will succumb to CO2 in the same anesthetic way as other birds. But yeah, they're the champions of oxygen preservation.
Yeah, well, when they can dive underwater for so long, it's
Absolutely,
yeah,
absolutely. So they're adapted to do that, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting stuff, and without the work that you're doing in the background, our side of it, unfortunately, that has to be taken. It wouldn't be achievable without the work, what's going on from yourselves in making sure this is a controlled method. But beyond the method itself, how, particularly in depopulations and culling out of affected birds, how do the practical factors like the environment or the handling of the birds affect the welfare of the animal during this obviously a stressful time
Yeah.
for everyone involved?
Yeah, that's a really important factor. For example, handling or being exposed to a novel environment, these are very stressful for birds. So, and their duration actually, depending on the method of culling that's used, can actually last longer than the culling itself, you know. So if we're gathering birds and handling them in a group, that's going to affect others that haven't yet been handled and so on. And if the birds are already sick, then they're going to be even more vulnerable to these stressors. So um, if we can apply methods in situ in housing, that's good because then we can avoid that handling step and exposure to novel environments. But sometimes handling is necessary, especially if
Mm,
we want to use those kind of containerized approaches, which have their own benefits. So it's, strengths and weaknesses overall. Of course, I suppose the best recommendation is if handling is used, then we need to use good methods that, support the birds fully, which might not be quite as rapid as some other methods, but to
yeah.
do good handling methods and using people that are trained to do that, and taking care to do that, to minimise the welfare impact of that step.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, as we know, throughout this season so far, whole house gassing has been the preferred method if achievable, but there's also farms out there still where we can't simply use that method, and
Yeah,
we have to use a containerized gassing, which obviously does put stress on people who are involved in that
yeah,
and on the animal, because
yeah,
as you say, we have to go in and catch and bring them into and put them into modules as if we was populating or depopulating a farm in general working times anyway. So it is a stressful time for the birds as well, prior to
it
obviously
can
the
be.
end of
Yeah.
life as well.
Yeah, and I suppose one of the imperatives, though, is to make sure that we do a full depopulation that works effectively. And sometimes handling them and catching them and using a containerized system is better than applying gas in a housing system
Yeah,
where it's not going to be effective. So we don't want any birds to be, not culled by that
yeah,
process. So it's a kind of balance between welfare outcomes and reliability
yeah.
sometimes, and just some, as you say, some housing just isn't suitable for that. So I think, as I say, there's multiple factors. Every time we do this and decide when to do it and what approach to take, we're taking into account a load of different things. And some of them are welfare, some of them are not. But even within the welfare consideration, there's things to be balanced too.
Yeah, of course. And obviously, in your line of work and research, ethical considerations are clearly, they're a really important factor. And how does this ethical reasoning influence decisions about animal welfare during these emergency management situations?
Yeah, it's definitely an ethically challenging area because I work on culling and also slaughter. So, it is quite an
Mm,
emotive topic and it's important to reflect on that. The most common ethical justification for emergency culling is a sort of cost benefit analysis where we say we're going to accept harm to a certain number of animals to allow benefits or to achieve benefits for a greater number. That's our classic kind of harm benefit or cost benefit analysis. And this reasoning is normally pretty clear when we're culling a certain group of birds to protect, for example, the whole national flock.
yeah,
It makes a lot of sense for us to do that. And of course, also to prevent sometimes human spread of disease, which is, something that we'd all be very keen to do.
mm,
So for many people, that's reasonably well justified, although regrettable, but it's a necessary step to achieve those other goals that are important. There are, of course, other ethical stances that wouldn't agree with that as a justification, but most people accept that sort of argument. So when we're trying to actually decide what to do, when we're doing ethical reasoning, we have to identify the various options for action. And we talked about choosing between those a moment ago. and to develop arguments for each. What will the outcomes be? What will benefits will be achieved? What harms will be achieved? And then overall picking an outcome that tries to balance that as best as possible, always trying to achieve the greatest benefit for the minimum harm. So that's the kind of ethical approach that's taken both, I think, by the farming community and the governmental influences on that, but also I'm sure by live tech when they are deciding what is the right approach to apply.
Yeah, of course, it's a big field to
Yeah.
try and manage and to understand, the needs of each individual farm if it was to come, when it does come down to it. So for people, outside of the field and the field of research, there can be a misunderstanding about what humane management really means. How would you explain it in a way that balances societal needs and compassion?
Yeah, well, I think humane's quite a difficult term
Mm,
because it's quite hard to define. I think most of us have a sense of what we mean by that. We mean reasonable welfare, good welfare, acceptable welfare. There's slightly different takes on that. In the context of emergency situations for disease control, I think we could usefully interpret humane as an acceptable welfare standard, bearing in mind all the other things we have to consider that are really important around human health, environmental considerations, just the practicality of doing the job well, and the things we already spoke about. So I think that's a helpful approach. There's been a discussion over whether those kind of on-farm emergency methods have to be as good as slaughter methods or almost as good as slaughter methods or better than slaughter methods. That's a discussion that we could have. I think the methods we have are often as good as some of the slaughter methods, which is good because that's another societal context where we end the lives of animals. The methods that I've researched, such as whole house gassing with carbon dioxide and gas-filled foam, nitrogen foam,
mm,
I think they meet that definition of humane, of acceptable welfare in that situation because they do prioritise bird welfare as far as possible and they are highly effective and efficient.
yeah.
And I think that means that they're quite good options to meet the complex needs of those situations.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, prior to this podcast, I was doing a bit of research into this, and there's a lot of information out there into the lap systems. I mean, is there
Yeah,
anything? Is it? And I see that that's being used over in some slaughterhouses over in the States, I think it was, or Canada. I'm just
yeah,
wondering whether you could touch a little bit on that, and is that a field that we're looking to move into over here
sure.
in the UK?
So LAP stands for low atmospheric pressure stunning, and it's a novel system, a new system that instead of putting animals in some sort of container and then adding gas, we put them in a container, then we gradually remove the air to cause a gradual decompression. So it's as if you're going up to high altitude in a plane and there's lack of oxygen in the environment at high altitude because of low air pressure. And so that causes unconsciousness and then death if it's held for long enough. And we've done a lot of research on this for slaughter contexts. And we found that this is a high welfare way to approach this. The animals lose consciousness gradually. They don't show aversion responses or negative responses during that induction, and then they are reliably killed by the process. So it has been used commercially in America and in Canada. And it is approved for use here in the EU. There hasn't been an uptake of it yet for various reasons. Um, for depopulation, it actually was being used in Canada for a while for depopulation of laying hens. So not for disease control, but obviously there's obviously need to depopulate those large houses. And it was a mobile unit that would go to different more remote parts of Canada and
Yeah,
depopulate these laying hen houses. So it has been used in that context. And in that way, it would be similar to a containerized gassing unit where you would need to catch the birds and put them into crates and so on. I suppose the advantage would be that you don't need to supply any gas
yeah,
because you just need a pump and a power supply to remove the air gradually from the system. So as far as I know, it hasn't been thought about for depopulation in the UK, but it certainly theoretically would be an option.
yeah,
And I think it's still the industry is still getting to grips with it and still, beginning to understand what's involved. It's obviously a bit of a strange process to think
yeah,
about decompressing animals, but see, it is gradual and it is similar to traveling to altitude, where you would naturally pass out from lack of oxygen. So I think time will tell whether it gets any use in that depopulation context in the UK.
Yeah, I was just interested to see how they're doing that over in the States and in Canada, and obviously in regards to not having to bring in gases, and
Yeah, yeah.
there's a logistical problem what can be solved there, and obviously not using gas in on sites or in slaughterhouses. I just wondered whether that was somewhere the industry was looking to go in regards to slaughter, um, at abattoir level, kind of, in the UK.
I think there's some interest in it. I think what's happened though is that a lot of the big industry players have not too long ago fitted big expensive controlled atmosphere gas
Yeah,
systems, so they're maybe not ready to replace those yet. What we have seen is quite a lot of interest from smaller producers, maybe organic and smaller
mm,
on-farm producers. And that's actually one of the users in Canada is a small organic poultry
yeah,
producer who wants to have their own slaughter system. And a lap system, the single chamber, which is what they have, is much more affordable than a huge, gas system, which they,
yeah,
they can't justify in space or cost terms. So I think that might be an interesting niche for laps, at least initially, where people could say, I want to kill my own animals on farm, I want to do my own slaughter process, and I can afford to vet this. It's fully scalable, so you can fit
yeah,
exactly what scale you would like of the system, which is less the case for the big commercial cast systems, which are obviously built for high throughput.
yeah.
So I think it's an evolving situation.
Ah, but
And
interesting.
to get the approval from the EU from EFSA to allow this in the EU, and it is allowed in the UK because it was just before Brexit that it was approved. We had to do a lot of welfare research on LAPS and do a whole bunch of studies to kind of look at its welfare credentials. So it's got good welfare credentials, and it's actually more studied than some of the systems that are used that have been grandfathered in.
Yeah,
So we do know a lot about it, and we're confident that it's a high welfare system. So I hope that it will be taken up. Certainly, it's certainly better than electrical stunning, which
yeah.
some people are still using, although less so.
No, it is very interesting, and that's something I'll be reading a little bit more into and seeing how that progresses.
Yeah.
Uh, but looking ahead, what areas of research give you real hope for improving welfare in large scale poultry production, while also supporting biosecurity.
Well, there's so many areas that could be improved, I suppose. So I can't really choose them all. But one area that's, I think, really interesting that I haven't done myself, but I'm aware of, is some interesting work happening around automation of bird welfare monitoring. I don't know if you've heard about this, using flock sounds or flock movements
Yeah,
and using machine learning and AI now to
mm,
interpret those. I think that's a really interesting development. And I think it could usher in a sort of new era of bird monitoring and enhanced husbandry, that perhaps we could have better environmental control, we could have earlier detection of disease outbreaks, which would help with the biosecurity side of things, and their impact could be reduced. So I think, again, that's still an evolving field, but I think it's got a lot of potential because one of the challenges has always been with poultry is the size of the flocks.
yeah,
And no matter how good your stock person is, they can't examine every bird. They can only get an overall sense of how the flock is doing, and they do a very good job of that. But
mm,
these enhanced tools could really help them to monitor more closely and more sort of rapidly anything that's going on with the flock. And also, I suppose it's my own research, but our work on air hunger and the welfare impacts of CO2 at sub-painful levels, I think is going to be very interesting to inform the industry about the welfare impacts, particularly of current controlled atmosphere stunning systems that mostly all use CO2 in phases that build in concentration. And so that's going to be interesting so that we can make a sort of overall judgment on those systems that we can at the moment. They
mm,
have great advantages. They're minimising shackling and poor handling. Every bird is stunned. There's great advantages to electrical, so I'm not dissing those systems,
mm,
but I think that's a question that's really outstanding. Is when we're seeing birds doing that hyperventilation, what does that mean to them? So
yeah,
we're doing some quite complicated behavioural experiments, asking birds to show us with their behaviour that they would prefer to avoid feeling that hyperventilation phase, which is challenging work, but we're trying to
yeah,
access those feelings the birds are having as best we can. their what we call effective states. So we're trying to do that with some quite complex methods. So that's, for me, that's an exciting area because it will have a big impact or a big bearing on how we view those commonly used systems.
Yeah, I've heard a little bit about this, Dorothy, and I think it's really interesting how you can get the bird to tell you and
Well,
get it into
yeah.
them. Well, yeah,
It's
put them
not
into that.
perfect, but we can try,
Yeah.
and we have got a couple of different behavioural paradigms that we use, which kind of together would give corroboration,
Mm.
around this. But we can never observe anything directly, so we're always inferring, but we have got some good methods to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think that it goes back to the bird will tell you
Yeah.
situation,
Yeah.
as you spoke about there at the start, around machine learning and all of these new infrastructures what they're putting into laying houses and broiler houses where they're able to monitor welfare and monitor movement of birds. I mean, coming from myself, coming from being a stockman and a poultry farm manager, you really when there's something wrong because of the
Yeah.
noise when you walk
Yeah.
into the shed. But as you say, you can't see every bird because of the size of the units that you're kind of working with. But I have seen some of the work what's going into, particularly around noise monitoring in
Yeah.
poultry houses, and I did see some research and looking at how, particularly in laying birds, how we had this thing where they smothered because of a noise, or they
Yeah.
went into the corners because an aeroplane had go over the top, or
A
a
panic
panic.
response. Yeah.
And I seen a little bit of research into they actually start swirling in the scratching area, but because of no real reasoning, and they're trying to learn why that is, and it
Yeah.
seems to
What the
be,
triggers are.
yeah,
Yeah.
what the triggers are. And it was a bit like when you see sheep start going round in a circle
Right.
and they all
Okay.
start going round in a circle, and it was
Right.
quite amazing to see, because it's only when you can see it from afar that you actually get to see
Work
it.
out what's going on. I
Yeah,
mean, I think that stock people are amazing, and I know that they do have a very strong sense of sort of holistically something's not right, and they are listening, and maybe not even realizing they're listening, but something's not right. And I think what we're really just doing with the AI and with those monitoring systems is sort of formalizing that. It's probably kind of happening already, but it would obviously be good in case there was something missed or people are less experienced, so that I think it's still got advantages. But I do think that the stock people know very well what's going on. But I just think it's something, an additional tool that we could perhaps use to help us act more quickly or identify exactly what is wrong more quickly, things like that.
yeah, of course, and I'm excited to see, as technology grows,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
we bring, research into that. I can see it really playing a part in the industry as a whole.
yeah, hopefully, hopefully.
Now, I'd like to, thank you for your time, Dorothy. Is there
It's a
anything else you'd
pleasure.
like to say before we close this off?
No, no, it's been lovely to talk to you, and I hope it's been of interest.
Yeah, I really appreciate it, and I'm sure our listeners will really like listening to the insights that you've given us. So thank you very much.
Thanks.
So thanks for listening to At the Farm Gate, and a big thank you to Dorothy McKeegan for sharing her expertise on animal welfare, ethics, and humane management in poultry. As the industry faces ongoing challenges, keeping welfare and biosecurity at the forefront, it's critical. If you found this episode useful, be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. We'll continue bringing expert advice to help you care for your livestock and make informed, compassionate decisions on farm. Thank you very much.